this room, I see all of you as inspirational leaders. I see a future head of state coming from this room. I see CEOs of large companies coming from here, and entrepreneurs who are not only going to create wealth, but are going to solve major social problems. So I'm honored to be with you. And what in my mind makes you all inspiring leaders is that, like me, coming from a poor, humble beginning in Westbury, of you have broken barriers to be here. And you can all have a pat on the shoulder for that. And having broken those barriers, while you sit here, you still overcome challenges and show resilience as you deal with various things like how to pay your university fees. And something that I'm really envious of is that you are digital natives. I'm a digital migrant. So you connect in a unique and easy way to technology, and you can use that technology to be a force for good. When we talk about inspirational leadership, I believe in the sensitive and important issue of racial reconciliation, that we can also be inspirational leaders. And when I wrote this book, there are various things that inspired me to do so. Firstly, I come from a marginalized community, have had my mum be the primary bread provider. When my dad had a nervous breakdown, he worked on a very exhaustive, abusive contract with a construction firm. So there was a lot of financial and other challenges our family had to overcome. And I wanted a story that can inspire people who also come from marginalized communities. And then I believe while the story of apartheid and the challenges and where we are today has been told internationally, a lot of it and the nuances are still not understood. So I wanted to speak to that, and I've been doing various interviews on radio stations in America and been speaking to various media outlets in the States to tell our story on an international platform. And then I'm painfully aware that globally, the racial divide just seems so much bigger than ever and more glaring. And in my book, I've told my story, and I've brought in stories. Okay, thanks. I've brought in stories of friends and thought leaders from around the world to give their perspectives and their experiences on racial reconciliation as well. So the second half of my book is very internationally focused. When you hear the title, My Blood Divides and Unites, it might sound eerie, it might sound interesting. So I'll share my thoughts on how I conceived of the title, and starting with the history of colored people in South Africa, which many of you would know. It started in the mid-1600s when you had the European settlers, and there was interracial mixing with the indigenous Khoisan. And what you may not be aware, there was also slaves brought in from Indonesia, Madagascar, Sri Lanka, India, and other lands. And these slaves were brought into the Cape of Good Hope as a way to support the Cape infrastructure of the Dutch East India Company. They had a lucrative spice business in the east, in what was then known as Batavia, today is Jakarta. And so the Cape Point was an intermediary point where their ships reloaded and docked off. And this racial mixing for South Africa, for past South African governments, were considered shameful. And the slave history of South Africa was considered shameful. So we never studied it at school. A lot of what I wrote in my book, I had to go and do digging and reading because the information is not easily available. And because the information is not easily available and it's not that commonly known, there was this mystery in the strands of my blood. Who am I? Or, where do I fit in? Where do I belong? And then I'm very painfully aware that there's so many divisions and contradictions in my blood. There's the slave master and the slave. There's the newcomer and the native. And then there's the black and white. And I had to grapple with these contradictions and upon reflection, decide I wasn't going to reject any ancestor, knowing that some of my ancestors have oppressed others of my ancestors. But I felt that rejecting any ancestor would be rejecting a portion of who I am. I chose, while not condoning in any way the atrocious acts of cruelty of some of my ancestors, I chose to forgive. And in reconciling these various parts of me and coming out with a mosaic, which is my diverse bloodline, I've come to realize that in spite of the divisions, my blood unites more than it divides. And I know that there are various individuals, societies, and nations have gone through periods of in the history which are shameful, and periods of history of conflict, which is difficult to reconcile. And I hope the message of my book can be useful to individuals, societies, and nations around the world who are trying to build inclusive and prosperous societies for all. The book covers various themes. I'm not going to go through all of them. We're going to have a panel discussion later to do more of a deep dive, but touching on some of the themes. One is choice. I'm here. It's a long road, even though Westbury is close, but it's a long road from Westbury to beyond. And I'm here because of choices of my parents to create a nurturing, supportive environment for me. I'm here because of an uncle who was a school teacher and took me and my twin sister for extra maths lessons when we were in high school. He just offered to do that, and that helped us get the grades in maths that we needed to get into university. And I know that all of you are here because of choices you've made and choices others have made for you. I also talk about lingering emotions from apartheid, how we can transform pain to healing, and how we can reframe our past in a way that we can move forward in hope. And then more practically, looking at the impacts of apartheid, which has created inequality and income divides, looking at how you can use technology, impact investing to solve problems in the areas of health, education, agriculture, water. The list goes on for poorer people so that the inequality can narrow. And I also put forward a case for why we need diversity and why diversity is linked to innovation and creativity. As I said earlier, I've brought in interviews of people from around the world. Up until recently, I spent 6 years out of the country, 2 years in America studying at Harvard, 4 years in Switzerland where I worked at the World Economic Forum. And I wanted to bring an international perspective in the book as well. I've interviewed people from Nepal to Rwanda to Mexico. And I include stories of my friend Huguette, who is of Tutsi origin and Rwandan and went through the Rwandan genocide as a child. And she talks about how while she is hopeful for a future, she still struggles with forgiveness to this day. I talk about my dear friend Chering, who I've visited in the rural mountains of Nepal. He's from the Aihomo people. They are of Tibetan descent, and they've been discriminated for centuries with the caste system in Nepal, and they don't even fall on the caste system. And while Turing feels that with decades of discrimination, racial reconciliation is not possible right now, he does bring together people on different parts of the spectrum around a common cause. So he started Idea Studio, which looks at social ventures in Nepal and how they can be supported. And he was the director for Child Reach Nepal, which is an initiative for students. And he's found a way of rallying people together around a common cause. And in addition to a message of healing, that I'd like people to take away from the book. I'm also would like to see all of us rise up and be inspirational leaders in the area of racial reconciliation. The book was healing for me. It brought about a lot of reflection, and I hope it can cause reflection for people as well as they read it. And I'd like the book to bring people to a place of choice. At this juncture in South Africa and in the world, when we are confronted with issues of race and racial conflict, are we going to respond with knee-jerk reactions? Or are we going to rise up and be intentional, inspirational leaders who, while banning bias and banning hatred, can bring people together? And in closing, I leave that question with you. What is your choice? Thank you.